Well, as that old politician thing, that's the second best introduction I ever had. The best introduction I ever had was when the guy that's supposed to introduce me didn't show up and I had to introduce myself. This was a close second. Many thanks to the National Civic League for this national conference and on local government in this 50th anniversary year of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, as well as the 1968 report of the Kerner Commission, on which, as was said, I served, in the formation of which I had a hand, and which now, as was also said, I'm the lone surviving member. Here lately, that's been said a lot in introduction, the lone survivor. My friend Jim Hightower, the great populist down in Texas, sent me an email after some of that appeared in the paper, and he said, that's what ought to be on your tombstone, Fred, the last survivor. As we were talking earlier with Doug, it might be a little late by then. At any rate, I'm honored to be asked to speak about all that, and also to speak about where we are today on the issues of race and poverty and fair housing, which were covered by the Kerner report, as well as what can be done now about these intertwined issues 50 years later. A physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. That's the way Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described the 1968 report of President Lyndon Johnson's National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, called the Kerner Commission, after its chairman, Governor Otto Kerner of Illinois. President Johnson had appointed this Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission in the wake of the terrible riots and violent protests that exploded in the black sections of many American cities during the long, hot summer of 1967, with great loss of life, awful human injury, and enormous property destruction, and causing tremendous shock, fear, alarm, bewilderment, anxiety throughout the country. The worst disorders were in Newark and Detroit, and they were only finally quelled when President Johnson sent in U.S. Army troops. Well, on the evening of July 27, 1967, my wife and I had brought a television into our living room, and we'd invited some friends over to watch the nationwide broadcast at which President Johnson was expected to announce the appointment of what was to become the Kerner Commission. Not more than 10 minutes before the president was supposed to come on, my youngest daughter, Laura, then in the second grade, came running in from the kitchen where we had a wall telephone, and she said, Daddy, President Johnson is on the phone for you. Well, as you might imagine, that caused a little stir in the living room. I went into the kitchen, picked up the phone, and standing at attention, I said, yes, sir, Mr. President. And he said, Fred, I hope you're going to watch television tonight. I said, I was. He said, I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about. He actually said, I'm going to appoint that damn commission you've been talking about. Flashback. I was then a United States Senator, of course, and 3 days earlier, when the Detroit riots were at their worst, after getting my friend and one of my two seatmates in the Senate, Senator Walter Mondale, to co-sponsor it with me, I introduced in the Senate a resolution to create a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission to look into the riots, not just from a law and order standpoint, but also to get at the fundamental causes and to come up with recommendations, quote, to make good the promise of America for all Americans immediately. I had the resolution referred to the subcommittee, which I chaired, and I held hearings on it the very next morning, with the witnesses being Daniel Patrick Moynihan, not yet then a senator, and Whitney Young, head of the National Urban League. But then it dawned on me that we didn't have to wait for congressional action. The president could himself name the commission by executive order. So I called Douglas Cater of the White House staff and urged such presidential action, following up the call, as Cater asked, with a hand-delivered formal letter to the president. So back now to President Johnson's telephone call to me. He said, "I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about." I said I was glad to hear it. He said, "I'm going to put you on it." I said I didn't expect that, but I'd do my best. He said, all this is word for word. He said, "Now don't you be like some of your colleagues." He said, "I appoint them to things and they don't show up." I said, "I'll show up." And he said, "And another thing, Fred." And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He said, "I want you to remember that you're a Johnson man." I said, "Yes, sir, I am a Johnson man." The president said, "If you forget it, I'm going to take my pocket knife and cut your blank off." He did not say blank. Sadly, by the time our report came out, the president, I think, thought I had forgotten that I was a Johnson man. 2 days after that broadcast, he called us together by telegram in the White House Cabinet Room and charged us to investigate the riots and recommend action, not only from a law and order standpoint again, but also in regard to their deeper causes. Quote, "Let your search be free," the president told the commission members. "Find the truth and express it in your report." And that's exactly what the Kerner Commission famously did, which, as it turned out, not only shocked the conscience of the nation, but greatly upset President Johnson as well. The Kerner report condemned violence and lawlessness in the strongest terms, saying, quote, "They nourish repression, not justice." And then came its basic findings, which are well known. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans, the report stated. Further, adding, "What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it." Great and sustained national efforts were required, the Kerner report said, not only to combat racism, but also to significantly invest in human capital to combat poverty as well. The intertwined occurs. Through programs against unemployment and low wages, poverty itself, inferior or inadequate education and training, lack of health care, and bad or non-existent housing. The report also made strong recommendations for improving the conduct of the media and the police, for greatly increased affordable housing, and for fair housing, integrated by income and race. Needed integration, ending discrimination and segregation in housing and schools. These recommendations applied to all Americans, quote, rural and urban, white, black, Spanish surnamed, as we said in those days, American Indians, and other minorities. But misinformed about its contents and distracted by the terrible Vietnam War, President Johnson rejected the Kerner report. And I think this is particularly sad because, without doubt, President Johnson did more against poverty and racism than any other president before or since. The report, unfortunately, thereafter was purposely leaked to the media by a person who wanted to lessen its impact. Before the commission could, as we'd planned, background reporters so that they would fully understand the reasons for the commission's findings and recommendations. This leak resulted in hastily written news stories which appeared throughout the country the next morning and which carried shocking headlines, something like, "White racism cause of black riots, commission says." Many people never learned the rest of the story, as they say, and not surprisingly, there was considerable backlash in the country. Still, many American leaders spoke out in favor of the Kerner report, including, in addition to Dr. King, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and my other seatmate in the Senate and close friend, Senator Robert Kennedy. And despite the opposition, because we still had a Democratic majority in the Congress, and because there was a spirit in favor of doing something about poverty and racism, the civil rights laws just having lately been passed, America made progress on virtually every aspect of race and poverty for almost a decade after the Kerner report. One of my two Senate seatmates, as I said earlier, and closest friend in the Senate, and the two closest friends, Walter Mondale of Minnesota, later Vice President, as the principal author of the Fair Housing Act, had for a long time, with the active support of President Johnson, been trying to pass the Fair Housing Act, but was time and again stymied by a Senate filibuster. Then, following the report of the Kerner Commission and strong speeches on the Senate floor by two of the Kerner Commission's members, myself and Senator Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, speeches which Senator Mondale asked us specially to make, the Senate filibuster was finally broken and the act passed by the Senate. And thereafter, in the wake of the great outrage and sympathy following the tragic assassination of Dr. King, the act was finally blasted out of the House Rules Committee and enacted and signed into law. As I said, for about a decade following the Kerner report, we made real progress. As Walter Mondale himself not long ago wrote in the New York Times on the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, President Nixon's Housing and Urban Development Secretary, George Romney, quote, fought against suburban exclusion, and, quote, civil rights organizations like the National Fair Housing Alliance worked with administrations of both parties to carry out the fair housing law. We made progress. Neighborhoods and schools were being integrated. Poverty was being substantially reduced. The achievement gap between African American and white students, for example, was being reduced at such a rate that had that rate continued, there would be no black-white achievement gap today. The Kerner Commission knew that oppressed people often come to believe the same bad stereotypes about themselves that the dominant society holds, and that peaceful but strong standing up to the dominant society, confrontation, can change that. We knew that the most fundamental change that had occurred in 200 years of black-white relations was that African Americans changed the way they looked at themselves, and that made white people change the way they had to look at African Americans as well. Soon, women and Latino, Native American, and other minorities profited from the black civil rights movement and changed their own self-images too. But with jobs alarmingly disappearing through globalization and automation, with conservative political change, and eventually with unfriendly U.S. Supreme Court decision and congressional cuts in both taxes for the rich and the big corporations and in programs that benefited poor and middle-class Americans, progress was slowed or stopped and finally reversed. Some improvement occurred, of course, during each of the Bill Clinton and Barack Obama administrations, but regression has been the trend since the mid-1970s, and that's sadly true today. There's still far too much excessive force by police, too often deadly force, especially against African Americans. White supremacists have become bolder and more violent. Housing and schools have been rapidly resegregating, locking too many African Americans and Latinos into slums and their children into inferior schools. Despite the fact that we know that children who grow up in an integrated community, as Walter Mondale wrote in the Times recently, have a, quote, better chance to graduate from high school, attend college, get and keep good jobs, earn a higher income, and pass on wealth to subsequent generations. The present Secretary of HUD, as you know, Ben Carson, is seeking to delay for 7 years the 2015 HUD integration rules, calling them mandated social engineering. And sad to say, too, unregulated, unplanned gentrification in so many cities is a factor in the resegregation that is taking place in our cities. As our nation has grown since 1968, our overall poverty rate has stubbornly remained virtually the same, while the number of poor people has increased from something over 25 million to something over 40 million. The rate of child poverty is greater today than in 1968, and the percentage of Americans living in deep or extreme poverty is greater, has grown since 1975. Ever since the 1970s, the African American unemployment rate, for example, has continued to be about double that for whites. Latino and Native American unemployment continues high, as you know as well. Labor union membership has shrunk from about 25% of private jobs to about 6%. Inequality of income in our country has greatly worsened. In the 1970s, the richest 1% of Americans took home something less than 9% of total national income. By 2016, they took home a fourth. 52% of all new income in America in recent years went to the top 1%. Rich people are healthier and live longer. What's fair about that? They get a better education, and a better education produces greater inequality of income. Then that greater economic power translates into greater political power. So where do we go from here? We know what needs to be done, and we know what works. A more progressive tax system, making rich people and big corporations pay their fair share. Stopping tax and spending subsidies that redistribute wealth and income in the wrong direction. Strengthening unions and eliminating the legal and other barriers which impedes the right of workers to organize. Raising the minimum wage to a living wage, which would be a giant boost to the economy and bump up middle-class wages too. We need more affordable housing, with housing and schools integrated by income and race. Better income for those who can't work and who can't find work. A sound, free public education for all, from early childhood through college. Education and training, with special attention to those put out of work by circumstances beyond their control. Health care for all. The basic American principles of equal rights and equal opportunity, whatever a person's social standing, zip code, religion, gender, or color. Investment in infrastructure, in science, in alternative energy, and in technology. Investment in ourselves. But how can we get these things done when present times are so tough? And these are tough times, with immigrant children ripped away from their parents with no plan for reunification. I'm reminded that Albert Camus wrote, "Perhaps we cannot prevent this world from being a world in which children are tortured, but we can reduce the number of children who are tortured." I believe that's our duty, and I know you believe that too. We can take heart, I think, from the fact that the great civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, who I think is a living saint, and others, began in a terrible and depressing time of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the law, rigid segregation as well, and harshest racism. And still they courageously resisted, persisted, and ultimately prevailed. Just before he was killed, Dr. King was organizing a poor people's campaign, as you know, the stated goal of which was jobs and justice. And the reason why he was in Memphis when he was assassinated was to support a local garbage workers' strike. We can take heart, too, from the fact that the polls show that the majority of Americans support the measures we must now adopt and the steps we must now take. We can take heart from the fact that we live in a time of unprecedented, growing, and powerful people's activism, more activism than I've seen in my lifetime, with great new efforts and organizations like the Women's March, Indivisible, Black Lives Matter, and most recently, the student-led and wonderfully diverse March for Our Lives. Finally, one of the great people of today's America, in my mind, the Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, founder of the rapidly spreading Moral Mondays movement and a new Poor People's Campaign, is right when he says, we can't keep fighting in our silos. No more separating issues. Labor over here, voting rights over there. The same people fighting one should have to fight all of us together. Reverend Barber is pointing the way we must go, showing that white, black, Latino, Native American, and other Americans can join hands in coalition with each other and with women, millennials, seniors, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, and others to work for their common interests. Because, as I like to repeat, everybody does better when everybody does better. Thank you. Thank you.